Ankush, I'm glad to be here talking with you today and discuss about the passwordless effort and how our clients are looking to that. My name is Eugert Jani, and I lead the access management practice here at CyberSolve.
Glad to have you here, Eugert. For everybody here, my name is Ankush Kapoor. I'm responsible for global delivery and solutions here at CyberSolve. And Eugert and I were talking about what a pain it is to work with passwords. And we're seeing industry make a change both in our personal lives as well as in the enterprise space. I thought this is a topic worth talking about, to help our customers and colleagues in the industry in general to walk down the path of, alleviating the pain that comes from passwords into a state of security that does not require passwords but only enhances usability and security. So, Eugert, again, glad to have you here. And really would like to, start with an anecdote. I mean, all of us are so familiar with how painful it is. Some of us have simplified our lives by deciding to put all our eggs into one basket, which is essentially a password manager, right? And I was just checking this the other day. There's this game called the Password Game, and what it does is it makes you create a different sort of passwords, right? And it'll start out by saying you should have at least 5 letters in it, 2 numbers in it. Then it'll say you should have the name of a month. The numbers in it should add up to 25, and it gets hilariously complex. Yeah. So while somebody's tried to gamify, what passwords are like today, the truth is that they're extremely infuriating. Users end up reusing passwords for that exact same reason because they're so difficult to remember, right? So what's your take on this current state of affairs?
So, and I think when the password started, right, I think since the beginning, people knew that this was not the most secret thing. It's just something that that you probably will use. But the hope was that if this thing is big enough, it will keep you secure. But what happened after? We got digitalized. The average user has 100 accounts now with all the digital services. Who is able to remember 100 accounts? Nobody is. And what is everybody doing? What is logical? They're using the same password over and over again. And just make sure that they don't forget it. They don't change the password on these 100 accounts. And even NIST is recommending to not change the password, because there is the other thing. If you change the password, you will tend to keep it as less secure as you can. Otherwise, you will forget where all these accounts are. I agree that the password manager is providing some help, that the password managers that are now, so at least you keep random passwords, but it's still based into an old technology. The way that these servers and clients communicate, they still need to share in the initial handshake this password. And that's why I wanted to talk what other solutions we have now that are more phish-proofing.
Sure. Yeah, of course. I mean, nature of authentication kind of determines, whether the password is sent or if it's a challenge handshake authentication and so on and so forth. But generally, it's been well accepted that passwords are a nuisance, right? And in a world that's moved so much to the cloud, it's very easy to spawn hundreds of accounts for a particular individual in the enterprise space. So really, it's not fair to expect somebody to have those passwords, change them frequently, remember them, and so on and so forth, right? So, yep. And of course, there's a lot of buzz around passwordless authentication and so on and so forth. But understand, in your view, from your vantage point, being in the industry for so many years, how do you see this transition going from starting out with traditional passwords to ultimately that utopia of passwordless authentication?
People want to aim for is not having passwords, right? And we know that from security, there are three things you can use: something you know, something you have, or something you are. And there have been always tentatives to go towards something you are or something you have. And each of them have their own challenges, right? Maybe you forget the things that you have at home, then you are out, right? Or other things change. And the other aspect is the user experience. How do you make the user experience appealing? Because there was always this concept of using these other factors, but they were not the devices. The technology was not there. Having a fingerprint to authenticate was nowhere there. So where the passwordless came, there were some anecdotal approaches that, for example, WhatsApp tried the first one, which was an SMS OTP. It was not the most secure approach, but the mass adoption showed that people were tired of password. They all opted for that solution. Even though it was not secure, they opted for the solution just for the user experience. So that tells us that the user experience to adopt passwordless is really fundamental and important.
Yeah, I would go to the extent of saying that this, picking on that WhatsApp example in particular, that was a classic example of eliminating friction from user registration, sign up, and authentication process. You didn't need any username. You didn't need to set a password. They just skipped that entire thing. It worked brilliantly in terms of user adoption. Yeah, go ahead.
And user experience. Yeah. Exactly. The other approach that people started to use, and especially when the federation was made up, was what Google, Facebook, LinkedIn were trying to make. They were saying, hey, use our authentication everywhere. And many users started to adopt that. Not everyone. It depends on which applications supported that as well. But many started to use that. Basically, you would be able to use your Google account and access everywhere. It comes with its own challenges because you have to keep track of which application you are providing your access tokens. And at the same time, it has an implied consent and understanding that your authentication to Google is strong enough. So with that said, it still provided a much better user experience than remembering all these passwords. But how many pages people have just accepted? Like when Facebook started it, they started for different applications that you were authenticating within Facebook, different small games. And I know that personally, when I was young and I was using this one, I had 150 games that were there. And then I was looking once to my Facebook and I said, how is it possible that so many applications have access through my Facebook? So it was not the best. It still showed the initial tentatives toward moving toward the passwordless, where users didn't have to create a new password into all these applications.
So that's an excellent point that you make, right? When you think social login, and often it will pop up nowadays and tell you what attributes will be shared, what information will be shared. But honestly, how many people are really very diligent about it, or would be diligent about it when they have a busy day? If you look at that, that's some sort of risk management, right? The website's giving you a pop-up, it's urging you to accept it so that you can go ahead and use it. And do you in that moment really use it or not? But that's the behavior of an individual. How do you compare, say, passwordless adoption of this kind amongst consumers versus how it is in the enterprise world? And of course, the enterprise world has its own set of challenges.
Yes, that's correct. And I think this brings mass adoption into the consumer side, in the retail industry. And I agree with you. Nobody will review the authentication. If I put myself in my retail shoes, I don't think if I want to buy something and I have the option to sign in there with Google, I don't think I will back up because that site is asking me for my username, my email address, my birth date. I will give what they need. Just I want to complete that transaction that I'm starting, right? So really nobody tries that. But it's not the same in the enterprise industry. The first thing, as I said, is the implied understanding that the authentication you're doing, the social authentication, is secure enough. And that is not true. And it's not secure enough for the industry. We've seen many cases where people get their Facebook account hacked, their Instagram account hacked, their WhatsApp hacked, right? And so that implied consent is not valid anymore. That's why the enterprise rarely have seen to adopt really a social authentication.
Sure. Yeah. And I think as a user in the enterprise, I've also, been through that life cycle of when MFA was actually called 2FA, right? Because it was implied that you will always use your username and password. And then once you're successful with that, then you'll have a second layer, right? You'll have one of those plastic tokens with a 6-digit number that will keep changing. It became a little convenient because you'll later have an app for it and so on. You'll maybe have a text and so on and so forth. And then increasingly, some organizations actually did away with the password and just said, give us your username and we'll text you something or put in that number. And willing to make a sort of compromise between a statically stored password, that had to be remembered versus boiling down to what you know or what you have and things like that. Right? Of course, that has created its own own fatigue, right? Especially if you're somebody like me who's not very happy about having SMSs that are no longer required, things like that. That is a mysterious, strange world. Tell us more about that. What is FIDO2? What relevance does it have to this space? Why should people, take that seriously?
So FIDO2 is a set of protocols that was used exactly for redesigning the way we authenticate. And we have to thank the FIDO Alliance for coming with this solution, which is very elegant and is fish-proof, right? And I want to explain this term. Why is FIDO2 considered fish-proof? Well, the reason why FIDO is called like that is because the password is never exchanged. So in any password authentication, even in the first authentication, in the first handshake, you have to share the password to tell who you are. With FIDO2, you never share the password during your authentication. What happens is that the server sends a nonce message to tell to the client, hey, I want to know if you are the real client. The client authenticates with their private key. They hash and sign that message with their private key and send it back. The reason why it's nonce is so you don't have replay attacks. And the server, which knows the public key of the client, is able to authenticate that and validate that message. So as you see, the private key never left the client, never left the user. Even during the enrollment, the first phase is only the public key left the user, but nobody can do anything with the public key. That's used only to validate a message that the user has sent. And that's why it's called fish-proof. So even if you have man-in-the-middle attacks, or you have these video phishing emails that ask you for your credentials, because the message is, nothing is sent, the private key is kept, users cannot use whatever user can message there, can sign there. So that's why it's fish-proof. The second part I wanted to share the flexibility that FIDO2 has. So FIDO2 is made of two components. The first component, which is for the server, is the web authentication, or called web auth. This is the protocol that enables any server to communicate via web with the rest of the FIDO2 that will handle the authentication. This is standard. The web auth is the part of the server that handles the handshake toward the server and the clients. The second part is how servers will authenticate. We have the setup, which is the protocol that is used for handling the authentication from any authenticator device, be it a security key, a Windows Hello, your device fingerprint, your face fingerprint. So that handles these devices. These are cryptographic devices. They have a private key that is stored securely, and they share through the setup their public key during the authentication. This combination provides so many different setups where you can authenticate and make FIDO2 so easy for the users. A normal user doesn't want to know all this technology. All they know is that they get into a device, they use their fingerprint, and magically they get into the application. And that provides a very good user experience, which is secure by design.
We know of a lot of large-scale adoption that has happened at a basic level in industry. Windows Hello, you referred to that. That's a great example. If I'm not mistaken, Mac OS Touch ID is also an example of this. Then of course there's Google, PayPal, and so on and so forth. So definitely there is familiarity and adoption at large at that scale. But we all know that the way a Google or say a Facebook or a Meta implements this for its end users often ends up being very different from how an organization does it. I remember having this discussion in early 2000s, with prospective customers. We're talking about help desk password reset automation and other things. And the thing was, how often have you called up the Yahoo help desk to reset your password, right? The answer was never. I just do it on my own. And the pivot to that was, but in industry with 10,000 users in a company, you still have a help desk for that. So why do you do that? Right? So definitely, there's an evolutionary mechanism in getting it from those larger organizations into mainstream enterprise. So somebody wanted to get started with FIDO2 in their organization, right? What would you propose to them? How should they go about it, to maximize the chances of success and ROI in it?
There are different devices that now many companies have already that are enabled for FIDO2. Many companies might have already Windows Hello. They're just not using it. They might have TouchOS. They're not just using it. And many of the devices, the end devices that they have, might have a password manager. Chrome has a password manager. If the client is using the Google services, they definitely have that. Microsoft has its own password manager. These password managers, they can handle passkey very, very well, right? So the proper way to enable it is to do an assessment of the perimeter of softwares and technology that the client has. And based on that, you can move forward toward what is the best approach and the most secure approach that applies to that company. As a themes, many companies that have Microsoft are enabling Windows Hello. That is being a main plan toward them moving passwordless. They want to have that experience. They get to their laptop, they authenticate with their face, and then everywhere else they can continue and use Windows Hello. Same thing for macOS. You might have other applications that you want to handle differently. Then you can use passkeys as well in particular scenarios. Now, the other aspect that you mentioned about Google and the mass adoption, I think it's more toward the other challenge that you have when you do passkeys or any change into authentication is the mass adoption. You have different type of users, and not all the users are prone to adopt new technology. But when you have a mass adoption, like Google is adopting it, Chrome is adopting it, Facebook is adopting, Apple is adopting it, then these users get confronted with this new technology and they start to adopt it, not because you are asking them, but because everything around them is using that. So that makes you easier to adopt a passwordless. And I think that's the fact that Google and all these big players are adopting passkeys is very helpful for all the companies as well, because they can be more bold now and more confident towards saying, yes, we will go with passwordless. And this is not a big change from what you are doing now in your everyday life.
So if just to paraphrase and to make sure I understood that, right? So we're saying, of course, there'll be some level of familiarity that your end users would already have with this simply because they're exposed to it on a day-to-day basis in their personal life. That's really the first thing. But beyond that, think, assess your existing technologies. You already have FIDO2 capabilities there that you're just not leveraging. And then from there, start making a plan for, how the features can be enabled, how they can be, rolled out. And of course, you want to minimize disruption. You'll also want to man anything that involves end users also requires good communication and all of that. So that's a pretty standard, IT change management plan or an IAM change management plan, so to speak. But I'm sure going passwordless also comes with some complexities or gotchas, that makes sense to pay attention to upfront, rather than discover them later. Would you have a few favorites of those that these are the kind of areas where people sometimes trip up or don't think of when they're going on the journey on passwordless, and something that they could avoid?
So when we are looking toward passwordless, we're looking toward using devices, right? And there might be different scenarios in the enterprise world where people cannot have access to devices. In particular, you cannot rely always to your smartphone for enabling passwordless, especially with FIDO2 key. We know that many clients, in particular warehouse scenarios, might not be able to have a smartphone, right? So in those scenarios, and in some other cases, these devices might not even be able to have an access to the network. So maybe the particular network where they are working is not connected with the rest of their system. So in these particular scenarios, you have to come with solutions with network segmentation and with replication of access, and using alternative devices like security keys if the terminals that you are accessing use them. And but those are the, let's say, the edge cases, but those are the cases that often bring back and keep back the passwordless scenario. What I would recommend is to isolate the cases, adopt the passwordless for your mass adoption, greatest peak of the users, bring the experience as close as possible to the same experience that the other users have, even though the underlying technology might be a bit different. Bring the experience as close as you can. And for the very edge cases, then you can look toward alternative solutions.
Makes sense. Yeah. I mean, essentially, if during the planning stage or as we are executing, if we are able to, foresee which use cases like this are going to cause issues, what scenarios can cause issues, customers definitely have, better options to deal with them. And I think that's why also having a set of best practices to work with upfront. Alluded to a few of them, but having, some best practices to work with. Make sure that you don't discover these when you're in the thick of things. You've seen them coming from a mile away, and you can cater to it. So I think that sounds good. I've thoroughly enjoyed this discussion. Eugert, where do you see this go? I mean, right now, obviously, passwordless is all hype, and adoption itself is what we're talking about. Where do you see this go in transform in the future?
So many technologies and many clients that are using passwordless approach, they are still having the password in the back, right? But I see tentatives or actions from Microsoft, from Apple, to also go passwordless since your first setup of your devices, right? So that is the first step where people are trying, and I don't think passwordless is a hype. I think it's here to stay. I think people have been talking for the password for a long time, but I think the technology now is there ready for them to really go passwordless. I see other alternatives to passwordless that are coming up. In particular, for example, is the verifiable credentials, where instead of you using password to authenticate to a centralized system, you bring your identity with you through a decentralized system. So I see that getting edge, especially in the governmental environment, where you can have a government giving you a badge with all your data that uniquely identifies that, yes, you are the person that is holding this badge, so you are the right owner. And this is nowhere less secure than when you present yourself to a branch right now and you present your governmental ID to authenticate. I see another alternative to the decentralized authentication here, which is the identity verification, which relies on the same principle in the sense of using a governmental ID. And I see that taking action as well. I don't see people doing an identity verification every time they want to authenticate. That is not a very good experience, but is a better experience than going to the office. So, for example, if you need to reset your credentials or during the first enrollment, I see the identity verification as a great accelerator toward moving passwordless.
Yeah, and I would also say that while not a regular use cases that involve high risk scenarios where you may have step-up authentication, those things can still come in play. So I think still have a use in the coming days. Awesome. Really good talking to Eugert and exchanging ideas on this. Always a delight to pick your brains on what's happening in the access management space. Any parting words from you before we wrap it up?
No, I think this is very exciting. I invite everyone to not be afraid of the passwordless. It's a very great topic. Everybody's excited about it, and they have all the reason to be. So if there is any challenge, feel free to reach out. I'm always have a pleasure to work with these topics.
Thank you again, and thanks everybody for listening in. Thank you. Bye-bye.